All right, let's get started. Well, first off, thank you everyone for joining tonight. I see some new names on the attendees, so thank you so much for joining. For those who were there last week at our nature-based solution, the first little part is going to be a little bit of the same information regarding the MVP program. But otherwise, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining tonight's webinar on impervious surfaces in Southborough. My name is Melissa Danza, and I am the conservation agent for the town of Southborough. And this presentation is in conjunction with a grant received under the MVP Action Grant Program. This meeting is being recorded and streamed live on YouTube. There will be a recording available on the town's YouTube page, and I will be posting it under the MVP section on the Conservation Commission's page on the town's website in the coming weeks. And just quickly, some housekeeping items is that everyone has joined this meeting as an attendee. So you are currently not available to turn on your camera or video yourself. So if you have a question during any point in the presentation, please use the raise hand feature, or I've enabled the Q&A as well, so you can type any questions in there. As I'm running this presentation by myself, please bear with me if I don't see your hand or question right away. I will try to pause as we kind of go through the sections, but if I miss any questions, I'll be sure to come back at the end, and I'll also have my contact information at the end if you have any questions after this. So let's get started. So a little bit about what we will be discussing tonight is the MVP program. What is it and what does it do? Kind of the overview of the MVP Action Grant, which is the impervious surfaces data layer. This is a snapshot of it, and kind of the results of that information. Kind of what are the impervious surfaces and the effects on climate change. So this is going to be a little bit of redundant if you came to the nature-based solutions last time. And then the results of this data analysis through this data layer and what our next steps would be. So the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, or the MVP program, was created and is implemented by the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. In September of 2020, we were designated as an MVP community after completing the Community Resilience Building Planning process that was funded through an MVP planning grant. And the town was required to do a 25% match, which was covered through staff hours. And it was also in conjunction with a grant from FEMA that was received by the emergency management team, specifically Neil Spacey, that enabled the town to update their local hazard mitigation plan as they go hand in hand. So being an MVP community requires annual yearly reporting due by June 30th. So I'll be doing that shortly, and outlines any work that we've completed towards the goal of increased climate change resiliency. And the main goal of this MVP program is to provide support for cities and towns to identify climate hazards, assess vulnerabilities, and develop action plans to improve resilience to climate change. To become an MVP community, you're required to have a community stakeholder meeting. So we did this in March of 2020, right before the pandemic hit. We had board and committee members, local businesses, utility companies, builders, MWRA, DCR, schools, both public and private, and some of our local land trusts. We identified the top hazards and vulnerabilities and areas of concern from our stakeholders, and it provided the top recommendations to increase resilience. Like I said, we also funded the update of the local hazard mitigation plan. We were able to use the MVP money, as it's a state grant, to be qualifying as the match that was required under the FEMA grant as well. So we did a great job in sharing resources and getting this done. And that summary of findings from that workshop is found on the MVP section on the Conservation Commission's website, and I've also linked it at the end. So after you become an MVP community and you keep up on your yearly requirements, you are eligible to submit for an MVP action grant, which we did this last funding round. And these grants are available so that cities and towns can implement these priority climate adaptation actions that were identified by the community, with a preference to items that include or prioritize nature-based solutions. So eligible projects under this grant include vulnerability and risk assessments, education and outreach, local bylaw updates, redesign and retrofit projects of stormwater systems, energy resilience strategies, climate safety and climate vulnerabilities, nature-based hazard reductions, acquisition of land, ecological restoration, and habitat managed to increase resiliency. So in May of 2021, we submitted the application and subsequently were awarded the grant in July of 2021 for this impervious surfaces data layer. So we hired a vendor and to create this impervious surfaces data layer, which means that from recent high resolution aerial imagery, the consultant outlined all impervious surfaces within Southborough to the best of their ability. So they use these maps during leaf off conditions, often fall and winter months, so they have a better view of the ground. And then we're able to determine the amount of impervious surface per parcel on both the commercial and residential side. And this data resides in a GIS layer, so the town can continuously update. And we're planning to make it available for daily public viewing as part of the town's GIS system once we work out all the tweaks. And this data layer is going to help us better understand the links between water quality and health and impervious surfaces with, especially around the Sudbury Reservoir, which is such a huge resource in our town. And the information provided will be able to help us more easily and accurately determine areas for potential improvement or reduction of impervious surfaces. This is where we get to see the results. So first and foremost, what are impervious surfaces? They refer to hard surfaces that do not allow water to seep into the ground. So the most common ones are driveways, parking lots, roofs, sheds, roads, sidewalks, pavers that are cemented together, compacted gravel, and solid decks. And this graphic on the screen is showing some of those different types of impervious at a residential scale. So you can see that the driveway, the roof, and the walkway are labeled impervious. And the main distinction, in kind of your everyday life that I want you to kind of understand is the difference in this graphic between the deck and the patio. So the patio is labeled impervious because assumedly it's a concrete or sealed paver patio. Because of the sealed joints between the pavers, they does not allow water to pass through to infiltrate naturally. So the deck, and the opposite end is an open concept, so that there's space between the wood slats for the water to reach the ground below, and therefore is considered a pervious surface in this instance. A swimming pool is also impervious because the liner of the pool do not allow water that is captured to infiltrate, which sometimes, tricks people up a little bit because you think of it as a body of water, but it is an impervious surface. All right, so one aspect that we've been focusing on, through the MVP program and climate resiliency and stormwater impacts is that increased impervious surfaces that we are encountering are intensifying the impacts of climate change. So, for the purpose of, the presentation that I did last week, in this, we're focusing on Southborough, but there are many other impacts in other parts of the state, especially coastal regions. They have a lot more additional impacts such as coastal erosion, coastal flooding, dune degradation, and things like that. But locally, we are dealing with decreased water quality and ecological health. If you think of all the debris and contaminants that are caught on roadways, we have leaks from vehicles, we have fertilizer, pesticide runoff, salt and sand during the winter, sediment, trash flying off trash trucks, and a whole bunch of other things that just kind of get caught on these roadways. And all of this junk that is sitting on these impervious surfaces during rainstorms are often picked up and directly discharged or transported to water bodies and wetlands. And we're also seeing increased rainfall amounts from climate change. So these increased rainfall amounts are also overloading our existing stormwater infrastructure, which then allows for more allows for more increased direct discharge because it would bypass the stormwater systems that we have. And, for example, along Route 9, that's a direct discharge from sheet flow. So that would be kind of a prime example of the areas that we are considering. So black asphalt and pavement also holds and stores much more heat than a natural landscape. So the increased temperature of the surface can cause increased localized air and ambient temperatures. And then the warmer surfaces surfaces when it rains warms the rain or the stormwater, which then is transported to adjacent water bodies, which can raise the temperature of the water. And this causes a lot of disruptions to aquatic health, both in species and water quality and, and reproduction. So you can see it's a bit of a cascading effect, especially in Southborough, because we do have such a large water body in which major routes run through. So by increasing the area in which water cannot penetrate, it means that there is less water that's naturally infiltrating back into the ground. So not only does that impact groundwater and the water cycle and balances, but increased rainfall amounts on impervious surfaces relates to decreased recharge and therefore localized flooding because water has nowhere to go. So it's a lot of cascading effects, and reminder that these are kind of the biggest ones that we hit here in Southborough. All right. So one of the main questions is, why would we want this information? And the answer is there's a lot of information that we wanted to and have been captured by this data layer. We can take it in a lot of different ways and use it for a lot of different analytics. But some of them is just understanding the amount and statistical data of impervious surfaces in Southborough. How do we compare to other communities in adjacent cities, and how do we compare statewide? What are the impacts of these services in terms of stormwater? The town has a MS4 permit, or municipal separate stormwater permit, which is through EPA and DEP for our stormwater system that the town runs. So the requirements of this permit not only have been increasing, but there's going to be increasing costs because of them, whether it's retrofitting existing systems or replacing them altogether. So how can we either mitigate beforehand to help reduce those costs, or is there a way that we can recoup these costs, whether it's through a fee or another system? Is there clustering around wetland resources that we should begin to target first and foremost that may be contributing heavily to possible impacts, and what effort should we be implementing? And is there a direct link between impervious around the reservoir and water quality health? This lets us begin to review data in comparison with stormwater outfalls as well to determine if there may be a possible direct impact. And most importantly, we want to prepare for development. We know it's coming, and if there are changes that we need to make now, then we should be prioritizing them. And this graphic here is from Mass Audubon called Losing Ground, which I have a couple more later in the presentation. And it shows, that we are what they call in the sprawl frontier. And some of our rates of development are going to be faster, essentially, than, mostly the western part of the state, some of the central, but that Metro West, kind of outside of 495, where people are moving away from Boston, is something that we're going to have to start considering. All right, so we get to the results. So there are 11 types of impervious surfaces that our vendor outlined for us within the GIS layer. They are trails, sidewalks, roads, recreational areas, pools, parking lots, pads and patios, large tanks like water tanks, etc., driveways, building roofs, and airports, which we do have runways in town. So this is a very zoomed out version of the data layer, and I overlaid an aerial image so that you can better see as I kind of break down the specific sections and show you kind of a blank slate without the aerial imagery. In this top right corner, there's going to be places where without aerial imagery, it looks very blank. It looks like, oh, we've protected, there's nothing in there. But in reality, it's a large body of water. There is protected land around it from DCR, but keep that in mind as you look at some of these other results. So these are two graphics showing the result of the amount of pervious surfaces through town. So this chart here on the left has the hard numbers of square feet of impervious and the breakdown of amounts by type within a percentage. So not unsurprisingly, buildings, roads, parking lots and driveways make up the majority of the impervious surfaces in town, with building and roads making up more than half by themselves. And to clarify on recreational areas, because sometimes, it sounds a little backwards in terms of it's open space, but a lot of these fields are compacted surfaces, whether it's a turf field or compacted dirt, etc. It doesn't allow water to infiltrate. So that's, it's important to capture those. And the vendor did a great job of doing this, of properly labeling what we call the polygons within the GIS information to ensure that all the features they have outlined are labeled and enumerated correctly. And one thing that we are still working on that we've kind of gone above a little bit than the scope was trying to separate each impervious type out by parcel. So we're in the beginning stages of it. We have the numbers. We're just kind of cleaning it up a little bit. But in the next couple slides, we're going to talk about some of the actual hard numbers and minimums and maximums. And they're not necessarily the maximums for only on one specific lot, but a continuous, pavement feature, which I'll demonstrate. And it's important to have both of those informations because not only do you want to know the average rates of impervious per parcel, but you also do want to consider, contiguous pavement, can go on for a long time. You need to be able to split it out and put it back together. So you need to look at it as a whole and what the cumulative impacts are, but you also need to sparse it out a little bit and understand if there are small changes that we can do on a more residential level that might have a bigger effect than maybe one larger change. So the first one that I'm going to dive into a little bit is buildings or roofs. And they counted 5,405 building roofs within the town. And note that this also includes, sheds and small structures, but also keeping in mind that sometimes there is limited capability in heavily wooded areas. So some, maybe very small structures could have been missed. So you'll see the total number of square feet for building roofs alone is 1,290,000. The minimum is 27. So like I said, keep in mind those small shed-like structures. And then the maximum is 340,088 square feet. And this one is actually this facility right here. It's the Harvard Research Facility off Pine Hill Road. And there is a high standard of deviation in this data, which means that the numbers are spread kind of out over a wide array. And this is consistent with what we would have expected because we have a large number of residential buildings, which are smaller, kind of around the median and the mean. Then we have this large gap to kind of our larger commercial buildings. So it is, indicative of kind of the trends that we see in Southborough. So this isn't as surprising, which is good. It's just kind of getting that number because they really do, add up to over 1 million square feet. And again, this is that Harvard facility. So all this gray is the building roofs and all of this green is that driveways. So driveways. Driveways, we counted 3,605 with a total square feet of 9,260,000. You see the minimum of 32.13, and sometimes that's, maybe someone has a second driveway that's just one pull-in. So that's where we really want to be able to get it per parcel to understand the real average per parcel in both residential and commercial. And it's something that driveways we really need to start considering in the future when we're discussing impervious along with buildings and roofs, because looking at the available land left in Southborough, there'll probably be a lot of redevelopment of existing lots, both commercially and residentially. So on the residential side, this means that often wooded lots, sometimes with one home existing that they tear down, and then they're being subdivided into additional house lots, often through an A&R process through the planning board, which essentially means they're kind of allowed by right because the lot lines that they create are already conforming to the zoning requirements and setbacks. So they, might not always fall under the stormwater management permit and won't fall under planning subdivision rules and regulations. So we really want to try and look at the cumulative effects of a lot of driveways. In this situation, it's a common driveway. So that's also something that we need to think of, in that it's built like a road, but isn't, is privately owned and maintained. And that's kind of why there's also that higher standard deviation as well for driveways, because you got those really small, just kind of, they live right off the road. That's all they need. But you also have the homes, in the wooded lots that has a long driveway to get up to it. And then these common driveways, which, they're technically not a road, so are enumerated as a driveway under these features. And the next one we have is pads and patios. So they're generally kind of smaller in the number of each area, with a total count of 2,240 total square feet, but also of 1,440,000, minimum of 23 square feet and a maximum of 9,029. It's also a higher standard deviation, but not as much as the other data sets, mostly because the minimum and maximum is so much closer together. So this example is Fay School right off Main Street. This is a good representation also of a lot of the different types of impervious that is mapped. So this gray, these are all the buildings. Green is the driveways. The pinky red right here are roadways. The orange here are sidewalks. And the mustard yellow, which are actually these right here, those are the pads and patios. And then this purple is the recreational areas that I was talking about, those fields. These pink are pools. And then actually these dark red is the trails as well. So you typically compacted, heavily compacted gravel trails. All right, and the last one we'll kind of go over is parking lots. So we counted 291 parking lots with a total square feet of 9,100,000. And on the screen here is what I'm kind of talking about in terms of still working with it to break it out by parcel, because the snip here, it's showing the DPW garage up here, and the kind of the Eversource building and other office building out here. But because it's kind of a contiguous and continuous pavement feature, this is counted as one feature in the initial set of data layer. So it is important, this also is near the reservoir. So it's good to have that ability to, again, look at it as a whole, in continuous polygons. And by polygons, it's exactly what this feature is. It's every line and curve. But if I were to go into our database and click, but not on the presentation, and click this feature, it would highlight the polygon and give me some more information, like the type it is and how big it is. So yeah, it's important to stand that continuity. And since our goals of impervious reduction is town-wide, we want to ensure that we don't look at this data with too narrow of a scope, but it's not to say that changes on a small scale don't matter, because changes and improvements at any scale will create an impact, especially within Southborough, because of the size and the location and the topography of our town. Right, so these are kind of some more zoomed in snapshots of what we were discussing. So this is the northeast corner of town. It's very residential. It's still hard to see kind of these individual features just because of the scale and the size we're looking at. But, thinking back to some of the previous examples, that we had, this was that Fay School. Here's the cemetery down here. We have our recreational areas and just a lot of subdivision neighborhoods. And then this is that northwest portion. So this is where a large portion of the reservoir is, down in these areas. That's that Harvard Research Building that I pointed out earlier. And it's not really till you look to the southern end of town. So this is Main Street running through, this is Route 9 running through here. Here's the Mass Pike. But you can see we have a little bit more going on. We have more residential routes. We're very limited in our north to south, east to west traffic movement. So we do have a lot of dead end cul-de-sacs and that type of layout for subdivisions. So I guess it's good sometimes in the sense that they're not constantly looping around, but it's hard to see some of those, smaller features. Here is a more zoomed in. This is Southville Road down here. Here's Corderville. So in this one, I have overlaid that aerial imagery again to give you a feel of how this would really look. What's hard to see, even on this scale, is that there are yellow tracks on the side of the roadways, and those are for the sidewalks that have been captured. And we wanted to capture these impervious surfaces different, than the roadways, because it's important to recognize some of the other initiatives in town and statewide. And one of those is the Shared Streets program. And while, there's a big initiative to combat climate change kind of through roadway narrowing and limiting that impervious, there's also kind of that conflicting program of the Shared Streets program, in that it's a little bit of widening roads and for better, visibility, for better pedestrian movement is really what it's there for. So you want to also have a separation between the road and the people. So taking that in mind and having to do that in a sustainable and kind of limiting, affecting way. But we also need to understand the impacts of both those types of surfaces, kind of understand the implications of adding or taking away from one or both. Because as much as we want to, kind of reduce the impacts that impervious surfaces is associated with, we also want to make sure that we are still implementing the connectivity through town, and people are able to move throughout town in a safer way, and they can reach those recreational areas that you can get from one trail system to another, etc. So it really is a balance in all aspects of life. And that also comes back to, thinking about development, and that, it is coming in some form of fashion, whether it's on a smaller scale or a larger scale. And so it's better to prepare, analyze, and start to make those changes now so that we can be prepared for when it happens, and that the effects of kind of that sprawl movement doesn't kind of catch us by surprise, as it shouldn't. So kind of most importantly, what does all this information mean? The total impervious was 55,236,557 square feet. And that's about 1,268 acres. Out of the total acreage in Southborough, which is 10,048. So based on that number and the fact that we have 9.5% water coverage through the reservoir, if we were to base our impervious based on land coverage only, kind of taking away that large water body, we'd be at a 14% rate of impervious surfaces. Kind of just thinking square miles, square feet throughout the town, we'd be at a 12.6 total impervious. And this is important because of the information we discussed previously, and how impervious surfaces are intensifying the impacts of climate change. We have a large body of water that takes up 9.5%, and these impervious surfaces are in some places, such as Route 9, causing direct runoff that is filled with contaminants from the roadway into our aquatic ecosystems and causing habitat loss and degradation. It's also degrading water quality and the impacts of the health as a backup drinking water supply. We always want to keep that in mind. And without infiltration, as it's being blocked by these surfaces, we have a decreased amount of groundwater recharge, which also can add to the drought, the availability of water supplies as well. And this is a good, kind of graphic about vegetated versus impervious cover. If we have vegetated areas, we have better infiltration, and that naturally removes pollutants. It's recharging the groundwater, it's recharging our stream-based flow, etc. But when we have impervious cover, you see that rainfall, instead of heading into the ground, it's running off. And, like I said, on Route 9, there's very limited stormwater treatment. So, that pollutants are going right into the Sudbury Reservoir. And the infiltration is lost, the groundwater declines. That's where we start to see really the impacts during the summer as well, when some of these, normally wet areas might dry up. And it could, affect public water supplies in the future. Not seeing any questions, but just a reminder, if you do, feel free to use the raise hand feature or throw it in the Q&A chat feature, and I'd be happy to answer them, or feel free to wait till the end. All right, so these are two kind of really great graphics. This one on the left is again from that Mass Audubon's Losing Ground. The most recent version was released in 2020, and it depicts the information that was collected from 2013 and 2017. I want to say that it's been I think the 7th or the 8th publication of this document from Mass Audubon. And one of the great resources, they have statistics per town as well, and also have the historic information to compare to. So it talks about the area that's been developed, square footage, any land that's gone back to conservation, etc. So studies that they have found is that at 12% impervious cover, there is a failure by most streams to meet water quality standards for aquatic life. So right now we're at that 12.6%. So we really need to start thinking about the implications and work towards becoming more resilient to the impacts of climate change. So while there's no quick fix, there's no one great option, what can we do to help, not stop development, but how can we do to maybe look at our existing impervious surfaces and reduce them, or to have design standards moving forward. It also goes to show that collaboration and education can be key in making the largest statewide impact. Looking at kind of these two scenarios for kind of 40 years from now in a build out scenario, if we kind of work together, whether it's from the boroughs or in the watershed, kind of that connection, that connected communities makes a much larger impact. And then this graphic here on the right is focused on the Massachusetts Bay communities. But it's found when a community hits 10% impervious cover, then water quality degradation really starts to begin. And while we are in a coastal community, we do have those important wetland resources, and more, wet of a community you are, the more important it is to focus on these impacts. So really thinking about that percent of impervious cover, we're already kind of at that threshold of there are probably impacts that maybe we don't even realize, and how can we start to build upon that? And our next steps. There are a lot of next steps that we can go. We're going to continue to review the data. We're going to split it out per parcel, and we'll release a little bit more information on the averages that come out from that, to determine that true average for residential versus commercial, and be able to better compare it to some of the other communities too that have done this type of data layer. The MVP Action Grant has funded other towns to do this similar work. We initially were looking at Holyoke's example, so on a much larger scale. But it really comes in useful. And, you can also review your bylaw requirements. Are we having too much parking? We want to incentivize our low impact development. We want to maybe review our stormwater management bylaw, which the Conservation Commission is, and maybe incentivize some of these nature-based solutions or impervious surfaces reductions, and determine if there are amendments that need to be happening. We could consider the creation of impervious surfaces mitigation or reduction plan, which also covers kind of under the MVP program. A lot of towns have done this, and that's both on a town-wide and, privately owned as well. So you kind of think about our large commercial developments, right now in Southborough, we do have a lot of vacant buildings on Route 9, and we're ready to get those redeveloped. So we should start thinking now as what do those what are those solutions going to be? What are the best management practices, or the BMPs that we say, going to implement? Is there a way that we can incentivize these developers to use these nature-based solutions? Is there something kind of maybe a trade-off that they're looking for, a list from the waivers that, won't go against the goal of what we're trying to complete? And yeah, incentivize the use of those nature-based solutions, which last week, again, is on the town's YouTube, and I'll be putting it up on the Conservation Commission page. I talked about what nature-based solutions are, some great examples, both locally, all within Southborough on the residential and commercial scale. So I got a lot of pictures up there and descriptions of what they are. We really want to collaborate with our local stakeholders for increased education. Individually and professionally, I believe that education is very crucial, to the overall success, kind of no matter what you're trying to accomplish, especially when you're talking about climate change and adaptation and resiliency. There's a lot of misinformation or miscommunication that's out there. And so just being able to educate the public, whether it's through these webinars or we send out monthly homeowner letters and things like that, and that having those opportunities available, so when questions arise or people wonder why we're trying to implement these particular plans, they have that documentation to refer back to and kind of have a better understanding if they choose to do that, but also understanding that there's always people in the office. If you have questions, please call, and being able to discuss with them in kind of that everyday jargon that allows them to better understand in their language, what the impacts of these impervious surfaces are. A lot of people think, oh, my roads or my, side of my driveway is eroding. I'll just, pave my driveway over and that should fix it, without, realizing that, well, that'll actually speed up the water. It'll go a lot faster and you'll probably get more erosion. So what are some other solutions besides just paving over something can we implement? And also kind of prioritizing that canopy protection. I talked about this a little bit more in the nature-based solution webinar, and what that canopy protection does. So one of the implications is that, in a lot of these lots, we have a lot of kind of leafed out trees. Those are taken down with new development. And a lot of the landscaping, people love arborvitaes, which really doesn't have a canopy. So it's not kind of catching that water the way that it should. And so there is kind of comment question. So it's just not about adding green space, right? Thinking gardens on rooftops and those office buildings. And it's not primarily about adding green space, but that's definitely the easiest way. Rip out your pavement and, plant some native plants on the side or something. But sometimes it's also just implementing hardscaping, to non-hardscaping. There's also stormwater infiltration features that are more of a hardscaping. So they're still using asphalt, as the side slopes to really get water where it's supposed to go, or swales on the side of the road are paved. So, in a way, it's adding green space, yes, but in a kind of a different format, and things that are natural, so on that roadside swale, it's just a grass swale, it's not paved. And the landscaping beds around office buildings, instead of kind of having retaining walls keeping them up that are kind of cemented together, maybe it's that kind of cobblestone look, and it's in a more natural area. So there's definitely, it's not just kind of conserving land and having better open space, but it is fundamentally kind of greening things overall, because you want it to have that vegetation base versus pavement or other impervious surfaces. And that's kind of a lot of what we have been working on for this GIS layer. There's plenty of other next steps that we could also consider, whether under the MVP program or otherwise with this data. As the Conservation Commission side, I looked at this and I really focused in around the wetland areas in town. So for my own knowledge, I'm going to be working in my GIS program, uploading the Mass GIS wetlands layer and really comparing where these areas, if there are large concentrations around some of the more important or larger water bodies, and kind of moving backwards to determine what those aspects are and how we can better address them. All right, so we do have a hand. So Kelly, I'm going to allow you to speak. If you just want to quickly introduce yourself, please.
Sure. I'm Kelly Frieda. I'm Regional Director for Wachusett and Sudbury Watersheds for DCR. It's not really a question. I just wanted to thank you, Melissa, and the town for taking on this project. The information that you have will be invaluable for us as we continue to look at climate change and ways to protect the reservoir in years to come. So I just wanted to take a second and thank you.
Thank you. And yes, DCR also gave us a letter of support for our action grant. And I think, at least speaking on myself, we have a great relationship with DCR through the conservation and the watershed side. So very thankful. We kind of did this data layer through the MVP program ourselves, but we are really connecting with other agencies. So thank you for that, Kelly. All right. So that's all I have for tonight. Here is my contact information. If you do have any questions after you kind of digest all of this, here are some other useful resources. So this is the Conservation Commission page where that summary of findings from the initial MVP program is. And then the MVP state page, the Resilient MA, which is kind of the main resource for the MVP program. And then that Mass Bay's kind of the study that they did, and then also the most recent Mass Audubon Losing Ground one. And I will be posting this PowerPoint as well on the MVP. So these are live links. But otherwise, feel free to stick around for a couple minutes if you have any questions you'd like answered. But otherwise, thank you all. It was great to see some fresh faces for joining tonight. I really appreciate you all being here. So thank you and enjoy the rest of what's turning out to be a sunny night. All right, there's only one or two of you left. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. You can also just head to the town's website and click on my name, Melissa Danza, on the Conservation Commission page, and you will find me. So thank you.